From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Later on in the program, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi and I will break down this week in news, including the budget battle happening in Washington, D.C. But first, a conversation with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse about the possibility of a government shutdown. Congress has until midnight on Monday to hammer out a plan for the country to pay its bills, or the government will be at least partially shut down on Tuesday. We spoke with Senator Whitehouse earlier this week, just hours before he was hopping a flight to Washington to tackle this looming crisis. Now, keep in mind, the Republican version of the funding resolution would keep the country up and running, but strip Obamacare funding, something Whitehouse and his Democratic colleagues vowed to stop. What would, if that doesn't happen, and if there is a government shutdown, who knows how long it would be, what would that look like to the average Rhode Islander? A lot of people might be concerned, oh, is my Social Security check going to be cut, if the government shutdown happens? What's it going to look like?
It would look like a lot of things. It would look like the FBI basically closing up, except a core emergency group. It would look like FAA problems in the towers. It would look like difficulty getting checks out to people. It would look for defense contractors, like everything ground to a halt. It would look like a lot of empty buildings at the Naval Station Newport. It would look pretty bad.
And we went through this a couple of times in the 90s under the Clinton administration. People should know that it isn't cheap to shut the government down. It actually costs the government a lot of money to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, is that on your mind? What are you telling your colleagues? How are you trying to break this stalemate in Washington?
Well, the people who think that shutting the government down is a good thing aren't in a state of rationalness where letting them know that, by the way, in addition to being a bad thing to shutting the United States government down, it will also cost money, makes a very big difference. And for those of us who think that shutting the United States government down is a very poor choice, then adding on the fact that it's expensive doesn't make a very big difference either. I mean, it's going to cause a lot of damage. And it's not just the expense of the government having to go through all the procedures necessary for the shutdown. It's also what that does to the economy. When federal employees across the country aren't getting paychecks, when federal offices are closed, when federal contracts aren't being issued, when federal checks aren't being sent, that has a very, very pronounced chilling effect on the economy. And we're still struggling, particularly here in Rhode Island, to get back from the Great Recession. So this is totally not what we need.
The fights, as you said, obviously over this Obamacare provision, whether to fund the Affordable Care Act going forward. I mean, when you talk to your fellow Democrats, is anybody wavering? Are people considering a delay? Is that it's just totally off the table?
Totally off the table.
Are you willing to consider any changes to Obamacare, you and the Senate Democrats? I mean, or is this just...
I think, we'd be willing to look at all sorts of changes if they happened in the regular order. If the House brought them up as legislative measures and tried to get a majority of 60 plus in the Senate and, work that way. That's the way the government works. That's the way Congress is supposed to work. What is new and what is different and what is wrong about this is that this is effectively the Republican extremists saying, hey, nice little economy you got here, nice little government you got here, be a shame if anything happened to it, so you better do things my way, even though they can't get it passed through the regular order. There's a reason that, we require the votes that we do, and we have to act bicamerally, and that prevents some things that are a bad idea from happening. And unfortunately, I think defunding Obamacare is a bad idea. And so the regular order would prevent it from happening, and that's why they've gone to these extreme sort of hostage-taking type political strategies.
Well, in terms of being willing to look at different aspects of Obamacare in the context of the debt ceiling debate, now different from the funding.
Different from the funding.
The debt ceiling debate, the president over the weekend picked up the phone, told Speaker Boehner there will be no negotiations over the debt ceiling. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
You would let the country fall into default rather than talk to the other side?
I think that, we've been through this before. And when the Republicans take the credit of the United States and make it a hostage even if they don't shoot the hostage, making it a hostage is still bad for our country. It's still bad for our economy. It still rattles world markets. They have to be weaned off that kind of behavior. And frankly, it's irresponsible to even consider it, as many Republicans have said. So I think the president has done the right thing to say, look, we've run up these bills. We owe this money. You need to pass a debt limit. And then we can continue to have discussions about how much more we want to do on the budget. We've cut $2 trillion already out of the budget. Are we willing to do more? Of course. All they have to do is be balanced with us and not just insist on nothing but clobbering the poor and the middle class all the time. But this business of just living with constantly having the faith and credit of the United States be at risk it's harmful. And
I have to say, though,
stopped.
after watching the 2011 debt ceiling fight, it's like a calling of a bluff. I mean, it seems like the Republicans, seems like there are many more members who are much more willing to consider breaching the debt ceiling versus Democrats, the party that believes in an active role of government and is more protective of that, would really allow that to happen. President Obama blinked once before. Now there's sequestration, which none of you like, but it's in place.
Yeah.
I mean, can you really rule out that that's not going to happen again?
I can't rule it out, but I think it's a very, very small chance, and it would require the president to basically do great damage to his own credibility. He has now said, look, this is done. We're not going to play this game any longer. Pass the debt limit, and let's go on to proper negotiations. If you want to talk about the budget, let us go to conference between the House and the Senate budgets, and let us work something out the way legislatures are supposed to. But the business of putting a gun to the head of the economy and saying, do it our way or we shoot, it creates too much risk that one day the gun goes off.
You know, the discussion of the debt ceiling, I think, makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Washington has raised the debt ceiling many, many times. Over
80 or something like that.
Over the
over and
last
over.
several decades.
Mostly under Republican presidents and mostly with no theatrics.
But the theatrics, the brinkmanship that's happening in Congress has brought this to the forefront. What's the tipping point where you would want more cuts, say, to stop raising the debt ceiling? You know, I think a lot of people, again, feel anxious that, well, we just keep piling on more and more debt. At what point is it not okay with you?
I think that it will never be okay with me not to raise the debt ceiling. Because what that does is that puts the United States government into default. And we are too essential economically to the world, not to mention to our own people's welfare, to allow that to happen. If you want to solve the problem of our debt being too high and of our recurring deficits, you solve that through the budget process. And you pass a budget and the two houses agree, and you work your way down that way. You don't use this really nuclear threat to force that. And you certainly don't go off that cliff.
I mentioned in 2011, that's where sequestration came from, was the argument over that time. And I will say, listening to the Democrats talking right now, it now seems like the fight is over this whether to fund Obamacare issue, which would seem to mean the sequester is going to stay in place under the measure to keep the government going and fund it. I mean, do you expect the sequester will still be the law of the land even if the Senate Democrats win on the overall issue of the defunding Obamacare?
The continuing resolution does not get rid of the sequester, and the increase in the debt limit does not get rid of the sequester. To get rid of the sequester, we need to take the Senate budget, which we passed, and the House budget, which they passed, and have the Senate and the House negotiate the differences in a conference. That's legislation 101. Unfortunately, the extremists in the Senate, and we have a few of our own, are preventing us from appointing the conferees that would go and sit down with the House. So that part of the traditional operation of, legislative process has been disabled as well.
I have to say, Senator, listening to it, it just sounds like maybe the whole 113th Congress is going to be a wash, where House Republicans disagree on almost nothing with Senate Democrats, and there are some Senate Republicans who are with the House Republicans on that, and that hopefully we'll get through a few of these true crisis moments like the debt ceiling, but other than that, immigration is, who knows where that's going to end up. The gun control legislation died, the budget issues. I mean, it sounds like we're just
the safety valve here is that the American people have a say in all of this. And the 2014 elections are coming up. And I think anybody who has done the kind of damage to the economy that shutting down the government would do, or done the kind of damage to the world economy that failing to raise the debt limit would do, or failed to pass the bipartisan, very responsible Senate immigration bill, is going to have a real problem going back to their voters in 2014. The big correction for moments like this is always in the hands of the American people. And how the Republicans field a presidential candidate in 2016 while they're this discombobulated, you know, if we put up Hillary and they put up Ted Cruz, it's going to be a burial. So they've got some real thinking to do about what the Republican Party is supposed to mean. Is it going to be the party of hostage-taking extremists, or is it going to be the traditional Republican Party that most of us grew up knowing and working with? And they've got to face that choice, and the voters are going to force that choice.
But that's
the real
not
adjustment.
until 2014. So to Ted's question,
it's coming sooner, though. As people get into cycle, they'll be preparing for that, and I think there's actually a reasonably good chance. I'd give it better than 50-50 that an immigration bill ends up passing, because there's so many Republican House members who don't want to go into the 2014 elections not having gotten that done.
I want to totally switch gears, and I have to ask you about Syria.
Yep.
You were pretty quiet during the debate before President Obama came out,
Yep.
pulled out the resolution, said he was working with the Russians on this deal. I took that to mean, since you'd been a bit hawkish on Syria, that you were prepared to consider voting for a strike, but maybe didn't want to get too far out in front on that. What were you thinking during that week before the president came out with this deal with the Russians?
I was skeptical about the strike. I was skeptical about what it would ensue. You have a very volatile situation in Syria. You have a dictator who is hanging on by his fingernails, using really obscene tactics against his own people in order to stay in power. And it's not clear that the kind of strikes that we were thinking of wouldn't so destabilize either Syria itself or just the Syrian military that you ended up with a situation in which there was either just uncontrolled free-for-all fighting among factions, or somebody was able to get their hands on some chemical weapons. Somewhere out there, a group of Syrian army folks who were holding chemical weapons would say, let's get out of here. Let's just dump this stuff and get out of here. This is getting wild. Let's go over the border. Let's get out of here. Forget it. Or the jihadis would be at the door, and rather than fight, they'd negotiate and say, look, let us live. We'll give you the chemical weapons. Things like that might have ensued worried me a lot.
But I also remember when you came back from your visit to Syria, you were very concerned about the situation, were suggesting maybe President Obama hadn't done enough yet.
I think he hadn't. I think we were behind the 8 ball all along. We should have been there with those loyal Syrian opposition forces early before it got polluted with all this jihadi influence. We should have been giving them the boots and the blankets and the bandages. And frankly, we should have found ways to give them the bullets. And we should have been putting much more pressure on the Assad regime. I think everybody assumed at the beginning he was sure to fall, so we could keep our hands off. We missed that judgment. And I think the result is we're now in a situation where now things like a military strike by the United States went out of the table. I think if we'd got it right at the beginning, we would never have been in that position.
Had you had to have voted up or down on a military strike, what would it have been?
Based on the evidence that I had heard, I would very likely have been a no vote. I was leaning no, and I would have needed more information and a clear explanation of how they were going to manage the consequences. All right, if you're destabilizing stuff, it's hard to say, well, we're going to destabilize it just this much. You can't calibrate destabilization that easily.
Let's wrap up this conversation back to the first question I asked you in a different way. Yes or no, should people prepare themselves for a government shutdown next week?
I think there's a sufficient enough chance of it that people should be prepared and should be thinking about it and should be watching carefully to see what happens. I think that I hope that we will work it out, but in many respects, we're bystanders in the Senate right now. This is going to be determined by what goes on in the House, and frankly, it's going to be determined between the Speaker and his extremists. And is he willing to call up a clean measure for a vote that will pass like that? Or is he worried that they will punish him, try to run him out as Speaker or whatever, and It's very much in his hands at this point. I hope and expect that he will do what he has done before, and that is to waive this so-called Hastert rule that doesn't allow Democrats to be considered in the House when they're thinking of bringing up measures, and call it up for a vote. That's how he did Sandy disaster relief. That's how he did the Violence Against Women Act. That's how he did the last fiscal cliff. All things where he was opposed by his extremists. But if he'd gone with them, it would have been a fatal blow to the brand of the Republican Party. Same situation again now. I hope he does it again now.
Do you think if he did that, it would be a fatal blow to his leadership?
Well, here's the interesting thing. What happens if the Tea Party people say, okay, we're done with you. We're taking a run at you as Speaker. We're going to take you out. And Nancy Pelosi says, look, we've still got a Republican majority. I got no problem with a Republican Speaker. I'll support you. Let's run bipartisan, and let's send these Tea Party extremists off to the padded conference room.
That would be something.
Suddenly you'd have a House that was behaving a lot like a Senate, where you had to be bipartisan to move.
I don't know.
Where the extremists weren't
from what
pushed
you've
so
said
hard.
about the filibuster in the past, I don't know if that sounds great or not to have a House acting like a Senate.
Well, you know, we passed the Water Resources Bill, we passed the Violence Against Women Act, we passed the Immigration Bill. Over and over, the Senate has passed
So do you feel like the Senate has gotten more productive? It's changed now? Because you were worried about how the Senate was operating.
I think it's steadily passing good legislation. We are missing out on some of the most important things we could and should be doing, like climate change. So we're a long way from perfect. But the House is in a situation where they can't even pass the most basic, ordinary, non-controversial measures because their Tea Party people will try to put something on that and wreck it up. So, you know, no transportation bill, roads and highways, no water bill. We give them a bipartisan, well thought out immigration bill. Can't cope with that. It's, I think if you could reduce the influence of the Tea Party in the House, you would see American government begin to move forward in traditional ways, and you'd see our numbers recover in terms of the...
Yeah, but again, there's a reason they're in the House. They were voted in.
Yeah.
So there's obviously support nationally for the Tea Party movement.
In certain sectors and in certain primaries. But that doesn't mean that they have to rule the roost. And if you built a bipartisan coalition to support Speaker Boehner, then you would have a different set of controls in the House, and they would be a lot more moderate and a lot more sensible and a lot more productive.
I know we're running up against our time limit here, but I am curious. Some people are going to listen who think you're a partisan warrior, are going to say he blames the Republicans for absolutely everything. Do you see any times where the Democrats or President Obama could have acted differently, maybe to allow less of this brinksmanship, or is it primarily a phenomenon you see all happening inside the Republican Party?
At this point, I see it basically all happening inside the Republican Party, and I think, frankly, most sensible Republicans agree with that, and frankly, that's been the observation of many Republicans recently and publicly, and they're fighting with each other on the floor of the Senate in open session, so it's not like it's any mystery. The Democrats have had moments like this before. I mean, there were times back in the 70s and the 80s when the Democratic Party was kind of in the wilderness because it was very controlled by extreme groups, and it took Bill Clinton to come in and bring us out of the wilderness, and we lost crushingly in some major elections. Think of Mondale. I think that's the situation. The pendulum has swung. The Republicans are now in that situation. I think they're looking at a crushing presidential election in 2016 unless they can sort themselves out.
Will you be with Hillary for that election?
I would be with Hillary.
All right, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Tim. Thanks, Ted.
When we come back, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi and I break down what's happening in Washington and locally, including a not-so-flattering Rolling Stone magazine article on Rhode Island Treasurer Gina Raimondo. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me for the second half, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi. Hello, Ted.
Hello, Tim.
All right, so we have two things going on here based on our conversation with Senator Whitehouse. We have the potential government shutdown, and then the, once again, a looming debt ceiling debate. What should we be losing sleep over, in your opinion?
I think really the debt ceiling, based on the impact these two things would have on the economy, the government shutdown, it'll certainly be a pain for people. It could cause headaches. National parks will be closed. It'll be difficult for federal employees. But the debt ceiling, the idea of the United States defaulting on the national debt would just have almost unimaginable consequences for the global financial system. I mean, if you think about it, the whole global financial system, banking and everything, is based on the idea that U.S. government debt, federal debt, is unimpeachable, will always be paid back. There's no question. It's the safe asset. The banks are all run based on that idea. If suddenly that's in question and the Congress might not allow those debts to be paid, you basically blow up the fundamentals of the system, which is why I'm still pretty skeptical of the idea that in the end there wouldn't be a deal, even if it's reached at the 11th hour.
We should point out that we're taping this program on a Friday. Our interview with Senator Whitehouse is earlier in the week, so a lot could happen. But I'm wondering, do you think that the Democrats would rather see a government shutdown now, or actually kind of okay with it? I was reading that in the Washington Post this morning, that they might want the government shutdown to happen, even if it's for a couple of days, because that way it would sort of disarm the GOP going into the debt ceiling debate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I saw that piece in the Post too, and I think the idea among the Democrats is that this is a way for the Republicans to sort of let off some steam about how angry they are that Obamacare is taking effect on something with somewhat less repercussions for the economy. On the other hand, politically, you can see why the Republicans might prefer a debt ceiling fight, because the average American doesn't, if they just hear it, they don't pay a lot of attention to politics. They think the government shutting down, that shouldn't be happening. Government should stay open. But if they hear adding more debt, even if the debt ceiling, it is to pay off debts we've already said we were going to incur, the average person hears more debt. Why do I want Washington to have more debt? And the Republicans might feel like they'd actually have more sympathy from the voters in that. But as I said, it would have huge financial repercussions if that's breached.
All right, let's shift locally. Not such a great week for General Treasurer Gina Raimondo. This caustic article from Rolling Stone author Matt Taibbi, no fan of Wall Street, as we know. He wrote an article, quote, "Looting the pension funds." That was the headline, and it set his crosshairs on Gina Raimondo. You could just look at the article on the screen right now. Obviously not very flattering for Wall Street, and not very flattering for Raimondo. How did it portray her?
Basically as a tool of right-wing conservatives who hate public sector unions and want to hurt employee pensions while taking pension assets and investing them in hedge funds that are going to make them a lot of fees. I mean, this is a very tough critique of Gina Raimondo. It's kind of conflating two different things, which is the 2011 law, which reduced benefits and cut the state's long-term shortfall, and then a separate move by Raimondo, which is actually proving just as controversial, which is moving about $1 billion of the state's pension fund to hedge funds, which cost a lot in fees. She says it will reduce risk in the long term, but her opponents say it's kind of a giveaway to Wall Street, and we could be doing just as well, if not better, with lower fees without hedge funds. So Taibbi has kind of put those two together and said she's part of this national movement to
the
her
money
pensions.
we saved is the fees we're paying to the hedge funds, what Taibbi put in his
Right,
author.
and you can see the narrative starting to appear that we're, I think, going to see in next year's Democratic primary with her versus Angel Taveras for governor, which is Gina Raimondo as too close to Wall Street, as really on the side of the 1%. David Siegel, the former state rep who ran for Congress, has a piece on Rhode Island's Future, the liberal blog today, making just that point. And I think she's going to really have to work hard to convince the liberal side of the Democratic Party, especially in this era of Bill de Blasio winning the New York City mayor's race and others, to make the case that no, I'm not captured by high finance.
What was her pushback? She pushed back on this article on Thursday, I think, when the article came out, put out a press release that afternoon. What did she put in it?
Her office said, and rightly so, that the article seemed to miss some of the nuances of what actually happened here. I mean, as they point out, don't forget, that pension law was passed overwhelmingly by the Democratic General Assembly, which is usually seen as at least somewhat friendly to labor unions. So this wasn't something pushed through without any public support. But again, that's the law versus the hedge fund $1 billion investment. That was done by the State Investment Commission, a much quieter process, which I think might be part of why that's actually proving a little more radioactive.
Boy, you're asking a lot of the voters, though, aren't you?
I don't think so, because I think they don't really. I think she might be. Yes.
That's what I mean.
Excuse me. Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. I think that's a lot for voters to take in about all this. And again, people are just mistrustful of the financial sector because of what happened in the last few years. And I think that could be a real problem for her, that she and her advisors have to find a way around and a good way to explain those things.
Let's stay in the pensions. We have about a minute left. You had an update on the pension settlement talks earlier this week. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so a union newsletter actually, Roger Boudreau, who's on the retirement board and represents the retired AFT teachers, said that they're now forming an organization, the plaintiffs in that big union lawsuit challenging the pension law. They're forming a committee to communicate about a potential settlement to the members about whether they're going to approve that, which is a pretty good sign that they might be getting close to reaching a negotiated settlement, something we've talked about on this program with Governor Chafee and House Speaker Fox in the last 2 weeks. So it's another sign. It looks like we're getting closer to seeing a settlement.
Did he violate the gag order, you think, by putting that in a newsletter?
That's up to the judge, not up to me, but it certainly, we aren't seeing much information come out, and that's part of why I wrote the story, because it was kind of a surprise to get that information out there.
Ted, before we go, big congratulations to you. 1 year of Executive Suite. There was a big celebration, I think it was last week.
Yep, that's right.
Executive Suite you can catch.
Thanks for coming.
Absolutely. I graced your presence. When do you see it on Executive Suite?
You can see it Saturdays at 10:30 and Sundays at 6 p.m. on MyRI TV, or Sundays at 6 a.m. on Fox, or get the whole thing online, just like Newsmakers.
For Ted Nesi, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.